So welcome to Get Your Garden Started with Kareen. She is here from Broken Ground, one of our guests who's here to help us through our different events, and we've got several more coming. We've got garden planning, space and species coming up. We've got not this Saturday, but the Saturday after, our Community Earth Day Festival. It'll be on the green at the library, and Kareen's involved with that too. And we've got another class in April about small space and container gardening, a week after that next one, so last week in April. So just keep those in mind and we will get started. The seed library is open, so we're excited to bring you some resources. Let me stop sharing my screen and pass it over to Kareen.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. Hi there. My name is Kareen Erbe, and as Brianna said, I own a small business in town called Broken Ground, where I teach people how to grow their own food. So first, I'd like to thank the Bozeman Public Library for inviting me to do this talk. I've been doing and partnering with the library over the last few years when they've opened up the seed library, and we've done seed exchanges before as well. What I'd love to do just to start out, I know most of you don't have your video up. If you are comfortable putting your video on, that would be great. But if you're not, I'd love it if people just shared in the chat. I think Lucy already shared with us why she's here, you know, where you're from and why you're here, whether you're like an absolute beginner gardener, or whether you have some experience gardening. It's sometimes helpful for me to understand who I'm speaking with, and we will have an opportunity for questions at the end of the session. So, but let's just start out by just putting in the chat, if you want, why you're here, why you joined us this evening. I assume it's because you're interested in gardening, but I'd love to know more. So Catherine, you're from Ohio and you moved here last summer. Great. Graduate student in microbiology. Never gardened before. Yay! I love introducing new people to gardening. So welcome. If anyone else wants to share what they're looking for. Oh, another person from Ohio as well. Tori, relocated to Bozeman. I've gardened before, but in a more forgiving environment. Yeah. Yes, so we can talk. Definitely, it is a more challenging environment for those of, you know, I've dealt with a lot of people who've come from, say, California or Colorado, or sometimes in the South, and definitely a lot more challenges here, but things that we can address also in the Q&A. Carmen, pretty good with indoor plants, but not that great with outdoor gardening. I'm the opposite, actually. So, lived in Bozeman since 2016, Veronica, a couple years of experience, but looking to get better at it. Kathy from St. Louis, wanting to learn how to best garden in this area. Oh, and then Susan, you started gardening last year with limited success. Okay, okay, I would like to know more about growing vegetables and gardening basics. Great, okay. Great. From South Texas, Sarah B. Yes, very, very different. Great. So we have some people from Ohio. We have some people that have been in Bozeman for a little bit, and others that are transplants from other places. So great. Thank you all for sharing. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And what we'll do is, if you do have questions, I think you can, I won't post them. Let's reserve the questions for at the end, I think would probably be best, and then we can have more of a dialogue. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hang on. Let me bring up, one moment, please. I thought I had my, here we go. Here we go. So, can everybody see that okay? Excellent. So again, I'm with Broken Ground in town. I'll give you my website at the end. just to give you a little bit of background about me, my grandmother was a homesteader. She had a garden and 6 children, and she kept a diary from 1943 to 1956. And in that diary, she kind of chronicles what she did every day, which is kind of exhausting to read, but it's actually great. She was in Minnesota, in central Minnesota, and so in a very similar colder climate like what we have here in Montana. And so it chronicles every day, you know, canned a bunch of quarts of tomatoes, or picked the beans, or picked the spuds, or so I feel very fortunate to have that. But probably like many of you, I did not learn how to garden from my grandmother. I learned from going to classes like you're going to right now. And so that, it seems like that kind of tradition a lot of times has been lost. And I bet for some of you, and you can share this in the chat, you know, how many of you had either parents or grandparents that may have gardened, but you didn't grow up necessarily gardening. So so I went, you know, and learned a bunch of stuff elsewhere, and I have I live here in Bozeman on a 3/4 acre lot. We have a pond, we have a greenhouse, we have fairly extensive annual gardens. We also have fruit trees and berry bushes in kind of what's called a food forest. So various different types of trees and shrubs. We also have chickens, and we managed to grow a good portion of our own food. My husband is also a hunter, so we get most of our meat that way. And we also, you know, just as an example, I didn't have to buy fresh fruit for 6 months. So from July through October. So, so there is, even though we do live in a cold climate, there's a lot that you can actually grow here. And I think, Brianna, are you testing? There are some things that are coming up in the chat. Is that something that you can see, or should I don't know, I can stop sharing and then I can see it as well. Can you see that? Oh, I can't hear you. You might be on mute.
Yep, I was. I didn't want to disturb you while you were talking.
Yeah.
Folks are just sharing their stories about grandparents who are gardeners and those
Awesome.
sorts of things.
That's great. Yeah. So, you know, that's a very common thing. And I think what happened is, you know, industrial agriculture kind of took over. We had a lot of convenience foods. And, you know, I look at my grandma's life and it was hard, right? So when convenience foods came along, I think that, you know, thank goodness on the one hand, because I think it also freed especially women up to do other things and to pursue other things. But I think we've gone too far the other way, where people aren't connected to their food and don't know where their food comes from. And so that's why I love to teach people how to garden and how to reconnect with that. So one of the first things that I encourage, you know, clients of mine to do, and just kind of gardeners in general, new gardeners in general, is to really understand what your goals are for your garden. And so one of the things that I like to do is understand what your overall goals are, because I can come on a site, right, and look at your yard, and you can, you know, put the whole thing into an edible backyard. Or if you're only wanting summer seasonal vegetables, that looks very different than if you want to grow a good portion of your own food. And so what I like to ask people is to think through, you know, why do you want to garden? And what are your goals? Is it that you just want some vegetables to have during the summer, or do you actually want to put up food so that you can eat it through the winter? So that's really important. Do you want to have a garden because you want to grow with your kids? Or do you just want to, you know, as low maintenance a garden as possible? Or like I said, do you want to develop this whole big kind of edible backyard? So I'm going to stop sharing for a second and just have people write in the chat or share, you know, with me verbally, why is it that you want to grow your own food? So Sarah B says you want to grow your own food. So Julie says grow a good portion of my own food as long as you can. Yeah. And it's somewhere in the middle for you. Summer vegetables. So Kay just wants summer vegetables, right? So that's going to determine, how big and extensive your garden is. As a beginner gardener, I wouldn't recommend going more than, having, and I'll explain this a little bit later, but, maybe 2 4x8 raised beds or something like that. But you do want to, if you're going to kind of grow into something bigger, you want to put some thought into that, and it'll kind of impact what decisions you have. Yeah, and Catherine says, that's great. Summer for now while I learn the basics with a more permanent indoor window garden for herbs. Wonderful. Yeah, so just think through that, because that also kind of makes you decide how big your space is going to be and what you're going to grow. So, if you want winter storage crops, if you want to grow you want food for the winter, you're maybe thinking more about winter storage crops, and you're thinking about onions and winter squash and potatoes and carrots and stuff like that. But if you just want summer vegetables, then you're thinking more about peas and greens and zucchini and beans and stuff like that. So that kind of is a good determining factor. So great, thanks everybody for sharing. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen again, and so just keep that in mind. So what I'm going to take you through, just in terms of getting your garden started, for those of you who have gardened before, this might be a little bit of a review, but you want to keep in mind 5 things. Sun, soil, seeds, start small and stay close is how I like to teach it. So the first thing that you need to know, and for those of you who you may already know this, is you need to choose a south-facing spot with at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. So preferably 8 to 10 if you can manage it, but 6 to 8. So your greens like spinach and lettuce and kale and stuff like that will be okay with 4 to 5. Your root crops will be okay, carrots, beets, with 6. But your fruiting vegetables for sure, like tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers, whatever, need that 8 hours of sunlight. So you really want to pay attention to the sun and shade patterns in your yard to choose the best spot. And you want to look at microclimates as well, because we're in a cold climate. It's really important to really take advantage of places where it's maybe a little bit warmer, especially for things like, for hot crops like tomatoes and peppers. So one of the things that's nice about this time of year, or maybe, like a couple weeks ago, or even when we got that snowstorm yesterday, right? Where does the snow melt first? On your property is going to be a little bit more of a microclimate. Usually that's maybe against a south-facing wall, but really observing that. And of course, here's a good diagram in terms of, the ideal garden spot is here, right? Where, the winter sun tracks lower, you get more sun in the summertime. In some of these areas right here, like this east-facing area is really good for kind of things that don't like the hot sun, that hot west sun. And so, you'd put maybe your peas or your greens or something in this area. But ultimately, if you were to choose a spot, this would be the ideal garden spot. Given that there aren't any, I'm assuming there aren't any trees or shrubs here, right? And so that's something that you want to do. If you have an idea of where you want to put your garden spot, but you don't know if you get enough sun, I'd outline it with a garden hose or something like that, or flagging, and then take photos or look out there at 8 in the morning, at 11, at 3, and at 5, to see whether you still have sun on that spot. And if you do, then that's a good spot for it. So people kind of often ask, raised beds versus in-ground beds. And I'm going to share with you, once I stop the presentation, I'll share with you a video that I've done in terms of the pros and cons of raised beds versus in-ground beds. But you've probably seen, examples of raised beds around town. You can do them with, 2x6s or you can do them with 4x4s, you can do them with corrugated iron. These are ones that I designed for a client. They can be higher, they can be raised, they can be octagonal shapes, and all different shapes and sizes. If you want, a quick fix would be to get these types of stock tanks that you can get it somewhere like Murdoch's. You have to drill holes in the bottom of them so that they have drainage. You put gravel on the bottom, and then you're building your soil up from there. So that's a quick and easy way to get a garden bed. Let me just check the chat here in terms of a question. Oh, you have one of those. Great, Carmen. So various different shapes. There's a lot of these metal ones that you see around town. I'm not sure that I would necessarily recommend them. They're nice aesthetically. They do heat up quite a bit. That metal gets really hot, hard to sit on the side of them if you do want to sit there. So I'm kind of two minds with those. It kind of depends on what you want to do. Raised beds are good because they do heat up faster too, and so that's good in a cold climate. But then of course there are in-ground options as well, where you can just grow your stuff right in the ground there. You probably would want to bust that sod, and then you want to add some compost to that area. So the second thing that you want to keep in mind is soil. It's kind of the foundation of your garden. When I go to clients' places and I'm troubleshooting with them in terms of, say, either pests or diseases or vegetables that aren't thriving, it's usually either a sun issue where they don't have their garden in the right place or it doesn't get adequate sun, or it's a soil issue. So we know that healthy soil means healthy plants. Ultimately, vegetables prefer a sandy loam. For those of you who have gardened here, we do not have sandy loam. We have quite clay soils. So we have to compensate for that with adding compost. Vegetables like a pH between 6.2 and 6.8. We're also here at a disadvantage. We have more alkaline soils. You can mitigate that again by adding compost. I wouldn't try to acidify the soil because that's usually not very effective. So you're looking at putting in inputs of compost and manure every spring. I am an organic gardener, so I don't put any kind of synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, or herbicides in my garden space. It's not good for the soil food web, and obviously it's not very healthy for us either. So if you're going to build a garden bed from scratch, I would say that you put a bed that has 50-50 compost soil mix. And you can, though, if you don't want, that can be a lot of soil. That can be pretty expensive too. So you can also use what's called the lasagna gardening method to save on materials. And what you do is that you put, you crack up the soil. This can be grass, right? You put a little layer of high nitrogen material, which means either manure, your kitchen scraps, grass clippings, whatever. You put cardboard on top of that. You put more high nitrogen material. Then you put 8 to 12 inches of straw or leaves. And then you just start out with 4 to 6 inches of compost and soil. So that way, you, rather than having to buy, 24 or 18 inches of soil, you only have to buy 6 inches, and you can grow straight in that. The first year it won't do as well, right? But as it breaks down, it'll do better every year. For an annual garden, I wouldn't recommend wood chip on top. I would put leaves. So just for those of you who don't know, just a quick talk just about soil nutrients and plant nutrients. So there are 3 main plant nutrients that you want to be aware of. There are all sorts of micronutrients as well that the plant uses, but typically, we are concerned about nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Again, many other nutrients that you want to be aware of, and you also want to be aware of kind of the soil microorganisms and how they help the plant grow. but these are just kind of your baseline to understand what's happening and why you need these things. And so you can see that if you don't have enough nitrogen, which is common, you know, one of the biggest things that you see are very yellowing plants, and you can add nitrogen, you know, again, by adding compost every year, but there are certain amendments that you can also use to boost the nitrogen in your soil. And then phosphorus, again, oftentimes people will notice, especially with tomatoes, when they put them in early in the season, sometimes their leaves turn blue and green. Oftentimes that doesn't mean that it's a lack of phosphorus in your soil. It's just that the soil temperature is quite low. And so that, that prevents that plant from taking up the phosphorus. So, you know, just again, gardening is a lot about observation, a lot about accepting the feedback from your garden, and then, you know, making adjustments accordingly. And then of course, potassium is also good for disease resistance and root growth and fruit production. There is a really good plant diagnostic lab, some of you might be aware of it, at MSU, where if you do have issues with your garden, you can send in samples. You can even, sometimes they can diagnose them just with photos, and you can send them samples and they'll be able to tell you what's going on. And so I'll drop that in the chat too when we're finished. So remind me actually if I don't remember. So to increase soil fertility, I use compost. I do use manure as well, which I say check your sources. And yeah, Tori, I will get to that question. That's a great question. Check your sources in terms of, you only want to use manure from herbivores. If you get horse manure, then you want to ask the person whether they have fed their horse with hay that has been sprayed. If that is the case, then do not use it, because that herbicide will persist in the manure and it will ruin your garden. So really check your sources. It's better to get, say, alpaca manure or steer manure or sheep manure or something like that, rather than horse manure. But if you do know that the horse manure is fine, then you can go ahead and use that. And then these are other amendments that you can use. Worm castings are really great. You can get worm castings from the local compost place in town called Yes Compost. They sell them. And there are other people that sell those worm castings. They're kind of known as black gold. And you want to encourage at all times these living microorganisms in the soil, which make the nutrients available to your plants. And then actually I will deal with Tori, your question about kitchen scraps. So you can use any kitchen scraps that you produce in making your meals, right? That are obviously not meat and bones and dairy products, but any kind of vegetable, you know, leftover vegetable stuff. I'll even, you know, if there's some leftover, I don't know, you know, pasta or something like that. I'm not as much of a purist, especially if you're building a bed. What I recommend with lasagna gardening is that you accumulate, you know, materials. You can accumulate your kitchen scraps in 5-gallon buckets for a week or so, and then you can throw that all down at the very bottom of the bed. And that'll be fine. That'll compost and decompose over time. So third thing in our 5-part framework are seeds. So plant what grows well in this climate. So that's another reason why you're all here, right? Is that your transplants from somewhere else where you have more available to you in terms of what grows. Plant what you like to eat is what I also recommend. You know, for a long time, people are always talking about how they love green beans. They love them, you know, they're so great in the garden. And so I would plant them, and I don't really like green beans. And so I didn't really, you know, I wouldn't pay that much attention to them, and I wouldn't harvest them on time. And then you'd get these really like not great tasting beans if you don't harvest them on time. So it would further perpetuate the fact that I don't like green beans. So plant what you like to eat so you have some skin in the game and you want to see it be successful, and tap into local sources where possible. So coming up here in May, a lot of the local growers will be having plant sales. That is my first place that I would recommend you get your seedlings. If you can't, well, that's the first place I would go. If you can't go there, then go to a local garden center. So I try to dissuade people from going to big box stores because they don't necessarily sell the varieties that grow well in this climate, but with local growers, you'll have it. So Gallatin Valley Botanical at Rocky Creek Farm will have plant sales. Three Hearts Farm will have plant sales. Amaltheia Dairy will have plant sales. Definitely go there. Three Hearts Farm also has their local, their seedlings at the garden center at Kenyon Noble. So you can go there also for sources. And again, the whole idea is that we know that the local growers will sell you something that grows well in this climate. Their livelihood depends on it, so they know the varieties that do well. Same with local sources, you know, go to a local nursery and they will provide that as well. Can you send out these local resources for plant sources? What do you mean by that, Tori? Like just write down the names of the farms? Is that what you mean? Maybe just write that back in the chat, and I'll address that. Oh, is that back in the chat? Yeah. So yeah, I can put those down. Actually, I'll do it right now. Gallatin Valley Botanical, Amaltheia Dairy, and Three Hearts Farm. So for those of you who are on social media, all of them are on Facebook and or on Instagram. So you can kind of find them that way in terms of when the plant sales are. For some of them, it'll be like now coming into May, they'll have a plant sale every, weekend or something like that. Or with Gallatin Valley Botanical, it might be during their farm stand days, but you can check into that. So for those of you who are transplants here, are new to Bozeman, it's important when planting here, timing is everything with planting. So your last frost date here in this area in the Gallatin Valley is May 26th, and your first frost date is September 16th. Now this is plus or minus 2 weeks always, right? And what we do know is that the climate is changing and that that things are becoming less predictable, but this is kind of an average. So the amount of days between your last frost date and your first frost date is your growing season. So our growing season is between 95 and 113 days. For the person who's in South Texas, right, your growing season is probably 365 days. So we have a limited amount of time. And what probably the folks at Gallatin Valley Farm to School in the next workshop will probably be discussing some of this stuff more in detail. But just so you know, when you look at a seed packet, it'll usually say on the seed packet the days to maturity. So if it says 60 days to maturity, great, you're going to have enough time. If it says 110 days or 120 days, then you know that you might not have enough time for that vegetable to mature on time. So when you're looking especially at varieties of tomatoes, at varieties of winter squash, things like that, really pay attention to the days to maturity and choose the ones that have shorter days to maturity. So that's what you need to know for your annual garden. And for any kind of perennial things that come back year after year, like fruit trees and berry shrubs and stuff, you need to know the hardiness zone. And the hardiness zone here in this valley, in most areas, is zone 4B. And so that means that will determine what trees and shrubs will grow and not die out, right? That's why we can't grow mandarin oranges here, right? Because they're a zone 9 or a zone 8, right? There are certain fruit trees and berry bushes that go dormant in the winter, survive those minimum winter temperatures, and come back year after year. So you do need to know that zone. So, and just a few other things for beginner gardeners, right? There are things that are called cool season crops, and there are things that are called warm season crops. And what the hardiness means is that they will withstand a certain amount of frost, and half hardy, they're a little bit, they'll withstand it, but not as well as things like broccoli and cabbage and kale and spinach and stuff like that. And then the half hardy ones are things like carrots and lettuce and potatoes and beets, right? So you'll see, at farmers markets early on in the season, a lot of this stuff is coming out, right? Because we have a cool season in June. You'll see a lot of these things, especially the kales and spinaches and all that kind of stuff coming out. Warm season crops are things like beans, tomatoes, and corn. And then you have the very tender crops, which are peppers, squash, eggplant, and melons. And these are things that when the frost comes, you need to cover these things. Or sometimes it just gets too cold here where they will just die, depending. But if you know, late in the fall, or even early in the fall, when it's going to be, if it's going to drop to 32 or even 34, or it's going to drop below 32, you need to cover those tomatoes, those peppers, or whatever. Otherwise, the frost will hit them and it'll effectively kill them. And then there are things that you direct seed, which means you take them out of the seed pack and put them directly into the soil. And then there are things that you transplant. And so the reason you transplant those things is that you want them to grow a little bit indoors or in a greenhouse in a protected environment. And so they're a little bigger when you actually put them in. So I'm also gonna put in the resources, I have a planting calendar, and so that gives you an idea of what to plant when. And then just for you to be aware of too, a lot of your herbs are perennial, where they come back year after year in this climate. So chives and mint and oregano, various other herbs. And then there are annual herbs that don't come back. So you have to plant these year after year. Basil, cilantro, dill oftentimes will self-seed in a garden. So what happens is it'll grow, it'll produce a flower and a seed, and those seeds will get dropped in your garden, and then they'll volunteer and come back next year. So it's an annual plant, but it kind of comes back in your garden. And then partially the reason that there's an asterisk there is it's biennial, which means that it grows for 2 years and then it dies. And then sadly, rosemary is also an annual. Sometimes what I recommend that people do is they put rosemary, they have it in a pot out in their garden, and then they just bring it in the wintertime so that they can still enjoy it. So like I said, timing is everything here, especially in Montana. I see people put things out too soon, and then what happens is that the plant gets stressed out, and then a stressed out plant is more susceptible to disease. So usually May is kind of the month here. You can sometimes put things in last week of April if they're protected, but May is usually the month, and usually people mark it by the whole garden is in usually by Memorial Day or the beginning of June. And so you're putting in your cool season crops at the beginning of May and mid-May, and then your warm season crops near the end. And again, with that planting calendar that I'll give you, you'll be able to see kind of what you put in and when. So the other recommendation that I have is to start small. Like I said, if you are new to gardening, start with 1 or 2 4x8 raised beds. And these are some of the easier veggies to grow in this climate especially. So I'd recommend you start small, and then you can grow into your garden. What I think it was Catherine mentioned too is just, see how much time it takes to maintain what you have. And then you kind of get a sense of like, oh, okay, I can do this. I can times this by 2 next year. Or, oh, okay, it takes a little longer than I thought to water. Maybe I'll put in an automatic irrigation system so that I can grow the following year and put, you know, more beds in. But what we're doing now kind of as more and more people are getting interested in gardening and growing, we're kind of retraining ourselves as agricultural workers, and we don't recognize how much work it actually does take. So, you know, I'll guarantee you, if you you may never complain about buying an organic tomato at $6 a pound again when you try to start, you know, when you try to grow tomatoes here. You know, it's more challenging. And so, you know, just be gentle with yourself too, in terms of there are a lot of challenges, but it's certainly absolutely possible, and so rewarding. So the other recommendation is, I would, if you can, if it works with the sun and shade patterns on your property, I would stay as close to your back door as possible. So we care for and maintain what we see on a regular basis. If you put your garden way far out, one, you will be less likely to look at it and observe what might be going on, whether things are struggling or not. And if it's closer in, you'll just maintain it and look at it more often. And besides which, it's more convenient. So if you can stay as close to your house, you know, my main annual garden is, you know, 12 feet from my deck. You know, or it's just off of my deck, which is 12 feet from my back door. So that's where my herbs are, that's where my tomatoes are, that's what I have to cover on a regular basis, so I want it to be close in. Whereas my fruit trees and berry bushes are much farther out, you know, they're 100 feet away. So that's kind of, you know, designing according to what takes your daily use and care versus what might just be growing all season and you don't have to worry about it maybe until harvest time, like things like fruit trees. So the other thing too, you know, for staying close is the hoses, right? And your ability to be able to access the hoses easily, because by July, when you're watering a lot, that can become kind of, you know, it's more time consuming. And then the other thing I want to say about watering, which I see a lot when I go and visit clients' properties, is you do not want to water every day. So with the exception of when you are first planting, you know, when you seed stuff and you want things to germinate, right? A seed will germinate based on heat and based on moisture, right? So you will water every day until those seeds germinate. But after that time, and especially if you're putting transplants in, if you're putting seedlings in, you want to water deeply and less frequently. Because what you want to encourage the plant to do and those roots to do is seek out water further down, right? If you water every day, you are, you know, the roots will stay at the surface. And as the roots go down further, right, you make for a more robust plant that will be thriving and will also resist any kind of pests or disease. So I typically water 3 to 4 times a week, again, deeply and less frequently, even in July, right? You know, our hottest month. And you want to mulch around your plants so that it keeps the soil moisture consistent. So what happens when you have open soil is that during the morning, that soil is nice and cool, but in the height of the day, you know, that soil, the sun beats down on that soil. So soil moisture, you know, water evaporates really quickly, and then suddenly the soil temperature increases. And so those temperature swings aren't great for the plant either. It stresses that plant out more. So that's my 5-part framework. Again, remember, sun, soil, seeds, start small and stay close. Few other things for beginner gardeners in terms of tools and supplies. You know, you want a watering can, potentially a hose and nozzle. A garden fork is my favorite tool, and I'll include kind of a video that I've done about my top 3 tools. A hard rake. You want a trowel, or what's called a hori knife, which is something that you can use to dig. A pair of gloves and pruners. You might need those as well. I recommend the Felco brand. I would recommend, you know, good quality tools that will last you a lifetime. I've often found really good garden forks and hard rakes actually at the pawn shop, oftentimes at, at the thrift stores. But if not, it is worth investing in some good high quality tools that you will use for years. A few, words of advice for beginner gardeners. Make time. It does take more time. So make time to be working in your garden. Do not be afraid to fail. That is something that I drive home. I have failures every single year. Like, I'll try something new every year, and some of it will work and some of it won't. Celebrate your successes, those beans or that zucchini that you get. Be patient, and then again, grow into your garden. Don't think that you need to have a 200, 300 square foot garden straight away. And then do take notes. And the phone is really great that way too. Take pictures of what you're doing so that you can kind of figure out and remember what you did the year before. That's really helpful to kind of, again, accept that feedback that you've gotten from the garden and how you want to make things different. So we'll go into questions, but that's my website. If you want to check it out, I have a ton of resources on there on my blog of various different things. I also do one-on-one consultations. As I've mentioned, I will come to your site and help you troubleshoot or determine a good location for your garden, and all of that good stuff. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to share some resources with you that I promised. So here is my vegetable gardening planting calendar for cold climates. Thank you, thank you, Tori. That was the most informative Zoom call you've had in the entire quarantine. Well, I feel honored. This is my video on raised beds versus in-ground beds for those of you who are considering those. What else did I want to give you? And now we can start. You can either physically, as I'm doing this, go ahead and either ask a question verbally, or I can answer it from the chat.
We did have one question before,
yeah,
earlier on, and it was from Julie, and she asked, I have one of those big compost tubs, and it is layered with kitchen scraps and grass yard waste, etc., but it isn't decomposing, and the yard waste is forming a sort of impenetrable mat. Any advice on how to break it down? Yeah, so I am just actually posting also in the chat I have a composting 101 video. So is it a big compost? What kind of compost tub is it, Julie? Is it is it one of those that you...
Sorry, I was on mute. Do you want me to just talk to you? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much. Hi. This is awesome, by the way.
Oh, great.
It is, no, it's like a big, there's a small one that has the little handle thing that you're talking about, but this is one of those big like vertical ones that's in vertical layers, and then like a trapdoor at the bottom, and you're supposed to take the finished compost out the bottom. Yeah. But like there's just this giant mat of like green stuff that's kind of like blocking any ability to access it. And then when you look in the rest of it, it's not, eggshells and all these kinds of things. It's just not breaking down. It's not breaking down. Yeah. So what I would do is I would take that thing apart if you can. And the reason things are probably not breaking down is that there's not enough moisture in there, and things might not have enough air. Okay. So I would take the whole thing apart and if you can, right, take that bucket away, not away. Lift it off. What am I trying to say here? Take it apart, put it somewhere else, then take those same materials and use that garden fork or whatever you have, put those materials back in, right, but mix them around and add water as you're mixing them and adding them to back into the compost bin. Does that make sense? Yes, it does. Thank you so much. Yeah, and then check out my composting video, and that'll give you more ideas too of how to best build a compost. Wonderful. Yes, Kay asks,
Yes. Oh, right. Veronica, when do you recommend adding the mulch to the top? Yes, great question. So yes, you should wait until after your plants germinate. Yeah. Yeah. So, and they can get just a little bit bigger, and then you can just put kind of leaves between the rows. Or if you're putting the tomatoes in, you put leaves between all of the tomato plants. Then Kay, what's your recommendation for controlling cabbage worms? So I would, with cabbage worms, so diversity is a big part of your garden. And so one of the things to do is to don't do, again, industrial ag is like monoculture, 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 right? In my garden, I have kind of a diversity of different things growing in one area. So I'm not just growing broccoli, I'm maybe growing broccoli and there's some cilantro over here and there's some like garlic over here. So you're diversifying, which confuses pests oftentimes. And then in addition to that, you might put flowers in your garden as well. So one of the things that has happened in our reductionist society is we've designed where like the vegetable garden is here and the flower garden is here and the place where the kids play is here, rather than think integration, right? What you want to do in your garden is create a mini ecosystem. So if you can encourage more beneficial insects to come into your space, and you do that by planting beneficial plants, right? So what I often do, if you have the space or it makes sense for your garden, you might put a perennial bed close by, right? Where you're planting, beneficial, and oftentimes those are herbs, right? So sage or chives or tarragon or something like that, that's kind of beneficial. And then in addition to some flowers that attract pollinators, right? So you can put a perennial bed close by to help with the pests and to help attract beneficial insects. And then you can put annual flowers in your beds, things like marigolds, things like calendula, things like cosmos, things like that. Like you can put them in your bed, and so you can kind of, diversity is key in a system. So that will cut down on your cabbage worms. The other thing that I do is I physically remove them. Again, one of those things when you're paying attention to your garden, the minute you see them, right, I physically remove them and I feed them to my chickens, right? Or, kill them somehow. So physical removal is probably the most effective. So if you get them early, then you won't have as many that will propagate. So that was a very long answer, but I hope that answered your question. Any other questions? I also want to find another, so type them in the chat as we're going.
So I have a question for you. When you're talking about this diversified garden and planting things, together that aren't necessarily the same thing, what does the spacing of that kind of look like? How kind of close together are these plants?
Right.
As someone who's never gardened before, I'm like trying to visualize what this looks like.
Yeah. So you still want to allow enough space for all of the plants to grow. So some of it looks like, here, I'll try to find you have a, do a quick sketch here, one moment, please.
We're putting your artistic skills to the test
right?
today.
Yeah, I know. This one's not very good. So one of the things, would be something like this. I don't know if people can see this, where say these are where your broccoli are or your tomatoes, and these are where you put your cilantro.
Okay.
So you still allow enough space for everything, right? but you have a few things in between. Or if you have rows, right? You know, what I recommend with people is that if you have a row, you can have a row of broccoli, but then in between put a row of calendula, and then you have a row of onions, and then you have a row of, you know, whatever beans that you're growing. So again, that it's not like this whole 4x8 bed is just broccoli, right? No, you want it to be, you know, broccoli and radishes and onions and, you know, some garlic or whatever, in terms of just being diverse. And then Sarah B, oh, okay. So Carmen says, I have a plum tree that has never produced fruit. Any idea why? How old is it? One of the things, depending on how old it is, one other thing might be just lack of fertility. One of the things that you could, I don't know if you've ever given it a boost with, you know, manure or anything. For example, we, at a client's place one year, she had an apple tree that'd been there for years and hadn't ever produced. And one year we just added we sheet mulched around the apple tree, right? So typically you don't, fruit trees and grass don't mix, right? They're competing with one another. So, you know, if you plant a fruit tree, you want to have a little area around your fruit tree, right? Dig a kind of a well, right? Where there's just mulch around there, so the grass isn't competing. And so what we did is we put that mulch, and then we added a whole bunch of manure, and then next year the tree produced. So it's probably 10 years old. I would try something like that if you haven't already. Is just give it an extra little boost and see what happens. The other thing might be too, whether is it, I mean, do you notice, does it flower? And if it does, when does it flower? Okay, so it does flower. Yeah. So I try that and see. The other thing might be, you know, there are self-fertile plums, you know, where they don't need another tree, but sometimes an additional plum helps with pollination and fruit yield. So Sarah B says, if renting, can I use containers? Yeah, absolutely. So ideally, you want something, the deeper the container, right, the more that plant has to draw on in terms of nutrients. But you can grow, you know, it depends on what you're growing too, right? So root crops, obviously you want them to be deeper. Fruiting plants, often you want them to be deeper. Things like tomatoes, you want them to be deeper and bigger. Things like lettuce, they don't take a lot of nutrient. And so you can have smaller containers where you do that. But I'd say at least 12 inches, if you can, would be good. Yeah. Any other questions?
So kind of related to that, if you're planting directly into the ground where you live, should you be trying to turn up about 12 inches of that soil to
Right.
get in that compost and get in that mix of new fresh soil? Because obviously a lot of what we have around here is not high quality soil.
Right. Yeah. So I think if you were to build a bed, so you have a couple options in terms of how to build a bed, right? You can either bust the sod, and then I would add like 3 to 6 inches of compost to that. You do want to break it up a little bit on that initial go around and establishment, just so that it is aerated, because we have such heavy clay soils. The other thing you can do is that lasagna gardening method, where you go up from your grass. So that's how I kind of established my gardens, because the ground was really compacted. It was very rocky because it was near the house. I imagine it was compacted with the, you know, with just the putting in of, who knows, the structure, the house structure itself, and or our septic drain field, whatever it was. So I just went above, but it's still in ground, you know, it's not a raised bed. They're just these little mounds that are in ground, if that makes sense.
Okay, that does make sense. Thank you.
So, and then I'll put my, again, that's just the link to my direct website if you need any other information. What was the other thing that, was there some other thing that I was going to give you that I can't remember now? I'm like, remind me if I don't remember.
It's about your favorite tools.
Oh, my favorite tools. Yes, thank you. Let me see, where is that? There's also, if you want, I do have a video about how to start seeds indoors. So if you need that, for, you know, that's something that I wouldn't recommend necessarily, you know, tackling, especially if you're like a beginner gardener, but long term, if you do want to kind of not have to buy all of your seedlings straight away. Where are my top 3 tools? Sorry, folks, I try to remember. If there are any other questions, let me know.
And we'll be saving all these links from the chat too.
Okay,
So.
great. Oh, I don't know where my tools are. Well, but I guess I can put them in the chat. What my top 3 tools are the garden fork. So I hope people know what I mean by a garden fork. So it's not a pitchfork. It's a garden fork, a hard rake, and then my pruners. Those are my top three tools. Sorry, I can't find that. But that garden fork you'll use all the time. So it's kind of like, you know, I'll share my screen again for those of you who are unfamiliar with it. It's like that, right? So it just has 4 tines. I'm not endorsing Walmart, by the way, but there you go. There's an example of what it is.
And what makes that different from a pitchfork?
A pitchfork has thinner tines, and it's usually a longer, handle, and it's not as strong.
I see.
But you'll use that garden fork to kind of till your soil early in the season, to till in that compost, any of that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Cool. Well, if there aren't any other Kay says, my plants seem to take well, but seem to wither midsummer. By wither, do you mean they look like they don't have enough water, or they're just not doing well? Or tell me a little bit more about what that means. I mean, it could be they turn yellow. Okay, so that's a nitrogen issue. So, and one thing, if you want to know, sometimes I recommend, if like UK, you're like, you know, what's going on? What I would do is I would go and get, in a garden center, you can get like a very simple soil test where you can test your NPK levels, and that'll give you a baseline of, you know, what you're dealing with. I would imagine that you have a lack of nitrogen, in which case I would add, you know, manure, steer manure, or whatever kind of manure, and or some additional compost. You might want to put some other additional amendments in there, but usually that's probably the case. What's happened is the plant has taken everything that it possibly can, right? You know, that nitrogen is needed for that vegetative growth, for that green vegetative growth. And so it's taken everything it can, and there's nothing left in the soil for it. So it's just like, I'm pooped out. Yeah, great. Well, great, everybody. If there aren't any other questions, good luck this season. Definitely get in touch if you have any additional questions. Check out my blog and all of the information there. And yeah, go to the next couple workshops if you want to learn more. So thanks again to the Bozeman Library and to Brianna for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here, Kareen. This has been so helpful, so informative. And for those of you who attended tonight, thank you so much for being here. Also, just want to let you know we are doing a kit this month at the library that you can pick up. It's a grow your own pizza garden. Perhaps the tomatoes will be a little bit too long of a season, as we now know, to really be able to harvest from, but it's got some wonderful herbs in there, some basil and oregano. So let us know if you want to pick one of those up. We have a link on the website so you can sign up for it. And we've also got the seed library open, so feel free to come on in and browse through the seeds.
That's awesome. And tomatoes, you can grow tomatoes here. I grow them. That's my favorite thing that I grow. So you can grow them. If you're new, I would say start with cherry tomatoes or smaller tomatoes, but you can definitely do it. Awesome. Well, great. Thank you, everybody. Good luck this growing season.
Have a great night. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Brianna.
Yeah, thank you. I'll end the meeting now. So thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, you're welcome. Bye.
Bye.